Welcome to the webinar series of the EDHEC Family Business Research Center on leading the family business in extraordinary times. We hope that you are doing well as your loved ones in these difficult times. We are very pleased to have you join us the third webinar of this series, From Writing to Interpreting Family Business History to Navigate Crisis, together with Ludovic Cailluet and John Seaman. My name is Rania Labaki. I am the director of the EDHEC Family Business Research Center, and I am an associate professor of family business and finance at EDHEC Business School. I will start with a brief introduction about our centers and activities that will be followed by the presentation by John Seaman around the topic of the webinar. And last but not least, Ludovic Cailluet will guide us through a Q&A session. The EDHEC Family Business Research Center was created back in 2012 with the support of family businesses and other corporations. Today, 8 years after, it was still supported by the Mulliez, Michelin, Roquette, and Viellard families. Our mission is to support and inspire family businesses and their stakeholders to pursue the long-term entrepreneur model across generations. We create knowledge, provide solutions, answers, and tools, and we offer educational programs and events that help the stakeholders connect and share together experiences. So our main activities are threefold: academic and applied research, which feeds the education programs that we develop, as well as the other dissemination activities. Our team is multidisciplinary and of an international background and experience. This is indeed very much needed because we look into the family business in a holistic way. We address, of course, the business, the ownership, the environment issues, but we make a special focus on the family, which is the distinctive characteristic of family businesses. Therefore, we provide a view that looks both into the financial and the socio-emotional wealth of family businesses. And our research and educational agenda spreads over different complementary topics: the succession challenge, the legal financial tax framework, the sociocultural impact of family businesses, and the family intra and entrepreneurship. We organize several events. In the current crisis, we are moving online with a series of webinars. And I will now hand it over to John Seaman, who is the founder and CEO of Saybrook Partners. Saybrook Partners is a boutique communication and strategy advisor to organizations and families around the world. John is an accomplished historian and consultant and a frequent speaker at conferences. He is also the author of several publications, including a book which features the bicentennial history of Brown's brothers Harriman. John holds also a PhD in history from Columbia. John, the floor is yours.
Splendid. Thank you all very much, Rania and Ludovic, for organizing this, which I think is obviously especially timely as we seek to navigate these uncharted waters. I want to do a couple things today. I want to talk a little bit about some of the concepts behind what we do and how we think about history and historical narrative for family enterprises, which, as Ludovic indicated, is very complementary to what he indicated. I want to go through three very practical cases of firms that have used historical perspective, I think, in important ways. And then I want to offer some final thoughts by way of process, structure, how family firms can and do begin to leverage their histories. But I start with some fundamental propositions, which I think are pretty uncontroversial. One is that organizations and families, no less than societies and nation states, have histories, and that those histories explain and define us. They shape our identity, who we are, our capabilities, what we're good at, our purpose, why we do what we do, our brand and our image and how we present ourselves, our reputations, how others think of us, and the emotional bonds that family members have among themselves. But those histories also have hold new options and possibilities for us because we're constantly evolving as organizations and families in response to people, leaders, events, and the larger forces, the environment in which we operate. And so therefore, understanding that history, understanding how all of this has evolved over time and in context is one of the most powerful tools that we have, that family enterprises have, for shaping a future. And it's actually our past. And this, I think, is all the more important for family firms, which have a very distinctive relationship with time because they are a multi-generational enterprise. They have a direct link between what they inherit and what they leave behind. And it's especially appropriate, I think, at moments of crisis when instinctively we all seek some perspective as a way to understand and ground us in our current predicaments. So what I want to do today is to take three family enterprises and show how they have engaged with historical perspective to help them master different kinds of crises. Those crises can be exogenous to the enterprise, financial, economic recession, depression, but they can also be some of the familiar challenges that family enterprise face: succession, ownership and control, and in some cases, emotional trauma. So I'm going to start with Brown Brothers Harriman, which is the private bank. By way of background, they are founded in 1818 by Alexander Brown, who was a Scots-Irish linen merchant, although the story begins much earlier. They quickly evolved from merchants to merchant bankers, financing the trade of goods rather than the goods themselves. And they became the premier firm in the Anglo-American trade in the 19th century. And then early in the history of the enterprise, Alexander Brown admitted his four sons into the partnership and established it as a multi-generational enterprise very quickly. It was during the Panic of 1819 that, which was America's first, that Alexander Brown first began to educate his sons in some of the business lessons he had accumulated early in his career. There's a very poignant series of letters, particularly between himself and his eldest son, William, in Liverpool about things like knowing your business, specialize, don't diversify, no growth for its own sake, and the importance of reputation, trying to rein in some of the more exaggerated and aggressive, headstrong impulses of his eldest son. And these lessons became part of the institutional memory of the firm, carried forward and adapted over time. When Alexander passed away in 1834, his four sons had an opportunity to go in very different directions, and indeed they tried to. There were a couple of the sons who had very different views on risk and how to manage the firm going forward. But after a strategic review, they affirmed those lessons, and they went on to adopt two strategies which had a profound impact on how they managed the firm going forward. One had to do with risk management, the avoidance of speculation, focus on commission businesses such as letters of credit and foreign exchange, an unwillingness to overextend, and a strong willingness to sit out overheating markets. The other had to do with how they managed people. They built a reliable network of agents and non-family partners and invested in them with an unusual degree of authority, and therefore, I think, established the primacy of partnership in a family enterprise. And this paid dividends over time in a series of crises over the next 70-odd years. The first, of course, was the Panic of 1837. This was a severe crisis in the United States generated by a speculative bubble in land in the western United States, and it triggered a long and painful depression in the United States. Economic growth didn't resume until the 1840s. And yet partly the strategy that the firm had adopted, that Alexander's sons had adopted, served them well. Although their liquidity crunch had them seeking loan guarantees from the Bank of England, they made good their losses within a year and were every bit as profitable as before the crisis, long before other competitors, merchant banks, recovered. And most importantly, they emerged with their reputation enhanced and their competitive position strengthened. One interesting aspect of this is that the person who went to seek that guarantee and negotiate their position in the United Kingdom was a non-family partner named Joseph Shipley. And of course, he lost much of his capital for that year as part of the losses they suffered in the one annual losses. It was the family partners who decided, in gratitude for what he had done, to make good his losses, his personal losses over that year, and thus affirming the value of partnership in the firm and the value they placed on younger non-family partners. About 30 years later, 1868, the firm on its 50th anniversary faced a succession crisis. There were a series of young non-family partners in the UK who were demanding a larger ownership stake, more management control, and more say in the firm's investment approach. Curiously, they had less appetite for risk than their older family members or senior family partners. But while the Browns were not ready to surrender family control, they did value the exceptional managerial abilities of the non-family partners and gave more autonomy. And so they struck a compromise whereby that autonomy was extended and institutionalized, and they established reserve fund protocols to manage those investments going forward. The turn of the 20th century, this same firm had since expanded and diversified. It had now become focused on international banking and sovereign finance. But many of these same lessons that Alexander Brown had established early on became still very much to the fore. In fact, a year before the Panic of 1907, a third-generation senior member, John Crosby Brown, explicitly drew on stories that his father James had shared with him to recognize the signs of a new crisis brewing. So the firm began took on a policy of avoiding major commitments, selling additional securities out of the market, some of it at a loss, but kind of improving their cash position, and launching a reorganization to make the firm more nimble. Most firms remained bullish, but this is what Brown Brothers was doing, and again was rewarded by largely sailing through the market, and they were also able to re-enter the market again early and benefit from a 45% run-up in the market subsequent to the crash. In 1929, the situation was somewhat different. The fourth generation now, Thatcher Brown, the senior member, was in charge. And he recognized this crisis as very different from the ones that had preceded it. And in fact, he recognized that circumstances were different, that in particular the death of one partner and the imminent retirement of others had left the firm short on capital, and that heading into the crisis that was unfolding in 1929 after the market crash, that he needed to seek outside capital. But what he did is he drew again on his family's lessons about the culture of the firm and a deep understanding of what that entailed to engineer a merger with another firm run by Averill and Roland Harriman that formed the new firm Brown Brothers Harriman. And these two firms had already been united by ties of friendship, by marriage, university connections, and the merger created one of the four largest commercial banks in the United States. So the Harrimans then on, surprisingly, I think, imbibed this venerable and dynamic tradition that they had inherited from the Brown family and drew self-consciously, I think, on this past experience. The very first year, a few months after the merger took place, the German government defaulted on a number of private loans, including potential loss to Brown Brothers Harriman of up to the entire value of the firm's capital. So this was a serious crisis for them. The Harrimans, who were very wealthy, intervened with a infusion of capital and essentially strengthened the firm and solidified the firm. But the implication of this was that the entire partnership now, the younger partners, both family and non-family, were in effect in debt to the firm, potentially hobbling the firm for a generation to come. And so what Harrimans did was to reallocate their own working interests in the firm to their fellow partners and enable them to retire their debts over time and preserve the vitality of the partnership, a recognition that all these partners, family and non-family, were in this together. So I think there's some key lessons here. Alexander Brown's sons, of course, had very different ideas about how to run their business, and the firm might have been undone by sibling rivalry, as so many first and second generation firms are. But instead, they embraced the spirit of fraternal compromise that became a model of the modern partnership and continues even today in the firm after it has since ceased being a family firm in the traditional sense. And also the culture, I think, culture and values of the firm were established early on, but they were consciously affirmed and reaffirmed with each generation and thereby became part of the institutional memory of the firm. I want to take a second case of a global trading enterprise. And again, by way of background, Founded in the 1850s, one of the largest commodities traders on the eve of the First World War, mainly on the basis of early innovations and adoption of transport and communications technologies, rail, ship, telegraph, telephone. The firm struggled during the interwar years in the Second World War, but were reborn in the post-war era under third-generation leaders, mainly through diversification in shipping and banking. The fourth generation in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s responded to changes in the market, including a glut of grain, through additional strategies, diversification, and experimentation. And then in 2005, another fourth generation leader, the prodigal cousin, as it were, returned to the firm after a long career outside of it and set the firm on a course to reinvention through changes in strategy and ownership and succession. In particular, he moved to seize opportunities in Asian markets, trying to refocus on agricultural commodities, and also made some key changes in ownership and succession. The future of the group, he said at the time, is managing the interests of the family. The family was primary in this, and the increasingly large ownership group of family shareholders was diluting those ownership stakes and making a clear line of authority much more difficult. So he consolidated ownership, acquired a majority control of other family shareholders, and then placed those shares in trust for his wife and children because he knew that he was ill and indeed soon passed away, leaving his widow in control. So the epilogue, of course, to this story comes in the last decade or so when the widow was facing a series of challenges to her leadership, calls by analysts and non-family shareholders to take the company public, and some family shareholders were uneasy with her leadership style. So she commissioned, I think quite interestingly, a historical narrative focused on the last 50 years of the firm's history. And she made it a point to actively engage family members from the other branch of the fourth generation as partners in that enterprise. And the history produced some key insights. One was that the reinvention under her late husband was not the departure from the previous fourth generation policy and strategies that many family members had recognized or thought it was, but rather a continuation of the transformations that had begun under that fourth generation. And also that attributes of family ownership throughout those preceding 50 years had, in fact, facilitated key successes of the firm to date, especially a culture in the firm that fueled more, not less, innovation because of these trusted relationships between family and non-family executives. This case is interesting to me, I think, because here we had the use of historical narrative to help smooth over differences with other family shareholders aligned to the branch of the fourth generation, and also reaffirm the value of family ownership, giving added force to her determination to resist outside pressure and to honor her late family's wishes. And the third case I want to cite has to do with C&A, the fashion retailer. We've talked about some exogenous crises and challenges of succession and strategy and ownership thus far. This one was triggered by a case of emotional trauma, and that was sort of interesting to me in how that they persuaded, or how they this particular crisis unfolded. The C&A was of course, the global fashion retailer. It was founded in 1841 by two brothers, Clemens and August Brenninkmeijer. First store opened in the Netherlands in the 1840s, but in fact the family's roots went back much further to the 16th century to Rhine-Westphalia, which is a largely Catholic area of Germany. From the turn of the 20th century, C&A was focused on mass market clothing, and they entered the German market in 1911 and quickly became one of the largest fashion chains in Germany. And they also entered the UK market in 1922. In the 2009-2010, the family began planning an exhibition to celebrate 100 years in Germany, which would be coming up in 2011. But it was during the course of that preparation and the research for that exhibition that they uncovered some unfortunate connections of the German branch of the family with the National Socialist regime in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And this was a firm that was legendary for its privacy, and the family might well have buried these revelations and dealt with them privately. But there were other factors arguing for openness. One was that other firms in Germany in particular had reckoned with Nazi-era transgressions. And a foundation in Germany that helped to shield firms from legal liability in exchange for coming to terms with and going public with these kinds of revelations. But that wasn't the decisive factor for this family. The decisive factor for the Brenningmeyers was, by all accounts, their strong devotion to their Catholic faith. From 1921, they had become under the habit of tithing 10% of their after-tax profits to charity. They took seriously a sense of ethics. And the revelations that had come about in preparation for this exhibition were a challenge to that self-identity and triggered a sense of a crisis of shame and guilt that they felt had to be met head-on. So they engaged a German historian, Mark Spohr, from the University of Regensburg, to produce a history of CNA from the time it started in Germany in 1911 all the way through the post-war era in the 1960s, but treating the deeper roots in Germany and the larger history of the family and the family enterprise as well. The family believed it was important for this to be a legitimate exercise, so they gave Spohr unfettered access to the archives. They also emphasized that this should be transparent and verifiable, and made sure that the materials on which he drew were made available publicly so that other scholars could verify what Spohr had done. Spohr later said, "We had a common goal, a complete review of the family history according to all available documentation and testimony from any surviving eyewitnesses. We wanted to be absolutely sure there were no ambiguities or mistakes." So what Spohr found was, as you would imagine, quite complex. The Brenningmeyers, the branch of the Brenningmeyer family in Germany, they were not ideologues, but they were all too willing to sacrifice their Christian ethics in favor of the business interests at a very difficult time. They played up their 16th century roots, for example, in Westphalia as proof of their Aryan origins to receive privileged treatment by the regime. They played their ideological card and argued that CNA had been one of the first firms to penetrate the Jewish-dominated textile market. They built up massive cash reserves, of course, that they couldn't export under currency controls under the Nazi regime, and so they used those monies to snatch up Jewish-owned properties as part of the Aryanization process during the Nazi era. And quite crucially, and most notably, they employed forced labor in the Lodz ghetto, setting up a clothing manufacturing operation there, and engaging Jewish tailors and leather workers, mainly from Eastern Europe, in extraordinarily difficult and terrible conditions. As Spohr put it at the time, the business opportunities offered by the Nazi regime were obviously more attractive than the family's Christian ethics. What was interesting to me about this case is twofold. The family did manage this reputational fallout. The book was published in 2016. It received generally positive coverage in the business and general media for coming to terms with a dark past. But by treating the episode as one chapter in a larger story, the family were able to put these particular transgressions in a larger context, particularly with reference to the post-war growth of CNA that had made the company one of Europe's largest retailers. But I think what also is important that they recognize this as a learning opportunity. By understanding the full dimensions of the corporate and family history, they could have a deeper sense as a family of their present-day culture and values and the need to live up to them. Maurice Brenningmeyer was the chairman of CNA's holding company, said it was imperative for the family at the time to have an understanding of our history, not as a burden, but as a platform. And so what did they do with that platform? Well, they began training managers about ethical dilemmas, recognizing that this was precisely the kind of complex, the dilemmas that the German branch of the family had faced in the 1930s and 40s and had failed to embrace or failed to live up to, were not altogether different from the ethical dilemmas that Trent managers would face in a modern firm, or potentially might face in a modern firm. They implemented protocols to assess labor practices of CNA's contractors. They became a recognized leader in the movement towards supply chain transparency, particularly after the Rana Plaza catastrophe in Bangladesh in 2013. They established their own human rights policies and regularly exceeded standards in compliance around some of these issues. And thirdly, they launched a significant expansion of their family philanthropy with the CNA Foundation, which has since been renamed, and notably, I think, putting an emphasis on learning from success and failure alike. So key lessons from CNA, I think it's possible to engage in family history at two levels. One, a largely celebratory exercise with the exhibition that they had launched in 2011, based largely on advertising and branding in Germany over the course of many years, but also with a serious inquiry proceeding in the background. A willingness to meet feelings of guilt and shame head on and to go public with those findings were important signs, I think, of emotional maturity and moral wisdom. The Brandemeyers had the option not to proceed with these sorts of with the level of transparency they engaged in, but I think did so for the very right reasons. And then, as I indicated earlier, treating these Nazi-era transgressions as part of a larger narrative made it possible for them to see for what they were: a horrible mistake, a distressing mistake, but one that could be learned from and built on. And finally, by virtue of going public, by virtue of following through on this historical narrative, the Brandemeyers allowed what they learned to shape their response. And so much of their both business management policy and philanthropy in the years since has focused on the very things that this history brought to light: the need for transparency, the importance of human rights, and larger sustainability issues around climate change and inequality. So I'll just offer a few final thoughts before opening up to questions. One is, I think that, as I think it was Machiavelli who first said that we don't want to let a crisis go to waste. The crisis can paralyze us into inaction, or we can use it as a moment to achieve clarity and drive action. And to that end, in my experience, at least as a consultant, is that there's no better time and resource than a sophisticated understanding of our own history as a way to achieve that clarity. Many of the examples I've cited here are families that had long since come to capture and internalize lessons from their long histories. And that in turn better prepared them, I think, to answer questions that these crises pose to them. But in fact, it's never too late to take stock. And for those families and their advisors who want to help them and start on this road to self-knowledge, I think there's some advice that they might bear in mind. One is that a good family history is true. Whatever else it is, historical narrative has to be based on verifiable fact and constructed on the basis of some professional research. History is not the same as memory. It's based on sources, methodologies. And it's important for the family to know what actually happened as part of this process. At the same time, it has to be sensitive to myth and folklore. Good historians, good professional historians engaged with family enterprises understand how and why myths grew up and why those myths are important, and how to distinguish between the ones that are helpful and the ones that are damaging. History for a family enterprise can't be just for its own sake. It must advance core family and business objectives. It has to be deeply contextualized. This is how we understand what makes a family distinctive and special, and what is important, all the more important then for them to engage with and remember. It has to be collaborative in construction. It's not easy to surrender the one's writing or interpretation to any one family member, or even more to an outsider, and therefore it has to engage as many voices as possible. And finally, I think it has to be honest. Difficult episodes are common to all families, and with them come true wisdom. And we should deal honestly and sensitively with those episodes. When families do begin this process, I think we should all remember that history, family history, like all history, is not really about the past, but it's about the future. And as Winston Churchill said, the longer you look back, the farther you can look forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. I will now hand it over to Ludovic to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, John, for the very inspiring presentation. We have a first question by Fabian. And Fabian asks you, who started or pushed for the investigation in the case of the Brenningmeyer's family? Was it a mutual decision or by a key family leader who pushed for it? Was it more the previous generation or the next generation who wanted the historical investigation?
I cannot answer that question. This is a public case drawn from public materials. I did not consult to them in particular. I suspect it was a joint or mutual decision. But I know from Fabian's research that is a potential point of discussion among families, whether it's a younger generation feeling a sense of maybe taking a different point of view than the previous generation. Unfortunately, I can't answer that question.
Okay. What roles do board members play in such decisions? Ask Vivian.
I think important. Those board members are either family or non-family. Like the best trustees and board members, they are helping to sound out these discussions, helping to process what I think are in some cases very raw emotions associated with both the process undergoing the history, of the process of self-reflection that is involved in the history itself, as well as the particular findings that come from that history. And I think, in my experience, have been able to mediate between the family and the history, as it were, and helping the family, bringing the family along in a more rational way sometimes, to understand what was important to take from that history and how to integrate it into the day-to-day business and management of the enterprise, and indeed the family itself.
Okay, thank you. The next question is a very interesting one because it touches upon the fact that remembering is a function of forgetting. And Juliana ask you, how to do when the firm wants to forget some emotional trauma linking the firm or the family to some historical episode. How to address this history? Do organizations have the option of forgetting as humans pretend to be able to? Well, the pretend is from me, not from Julia.
I think that's an excellent question. You're exactly right that forgetting is very much a part of remembering. What I would say is that through all of the work that I've done for families as well as for non-family enterprises, there is this question of what needs to be carried forward and what needs to be left behind. We cannot become prisoners of our pasts. And the exercise of commissioning or crafting a historical narrative, engaging in our histories in some way, is an exercise of understanding what has changed and what has not changed. How are we as a family, or how are we as a firm similar to or different from what has come before? How have the circumstances changed? How has the context changed that require us to behave in a different way, to adopt a different strategy, to adopt different values than we had in the past? The best way to do that, I think, is to deal with those issues, particularly difficult issues that have come in the past, to address them, to talk about them, and then to decide collectively, with the aid of historical perspective, how we move forward. Because again, this is all about managing change, challenge, crisis. As I indicated, history is not, family history in particular, is not about the past so much as it is about the future. How can we deal with that past in a way that's constructive, take what is important for us to move forward, and then leave behind the rest?
Thank you. We have a question from Natalia, who enjoyed your presentation. And Natalia asks the question of organizational memory and how to be completely objective in reconstructing the stories, right? So whose memories have more weight in developing the family narrative? Are there specific power relations at play in selecting which organizational memories to bring forth into the future true narrative? And how do we cope as researchers or you as consultants with these embedded subjectivities?
Again, a very good question. It is certainly the case that in every engagement that I've done, there is one particular client within the family who is believes in this enterprise and is pushing for it and is sponsoring this enterprise. And his or her concerns take precedence. What we do as consultants and as professional historians is try to engage as many people in that process as possible and try to make the case that having a history that is as objective as possible, based on real research, and engaging as many different voices as possible, is the best way to advance his or her interest, the interest of the particular sponsor. That it doesn't do any good to whitewash perspectives of another branch of the family. That the way truly to advance your own interest is to engage as many people in that process and thereby help bring them along to the larger issues that you want to address. But I won't lie, this is a very difficult thing to manage in firms. And when we have been in a position of feeling as though we are made to advance a particular interpretation that is at odds with the evidence, we will push back strongly and try to reach some common ground. And I have to say most families have been very receptive to that. In particular, again, this has to do with the role of the boards, who can sometimes help families separate sort of the emotional implications of the history from the more rational conclusions going forward.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, and especially your concluding one about the role of the board, which might be able to mitigate the fact that, for instance, in your case, as a consulting firm, at the end of the day, you have a client, and that client might be cousin A, who is different from cousin B or C from a different branch. So,
absolutely, and I think again we always make the argument, and I think we always make the argument that it is we should go where the evidence leads us. That we, meaning both the consultants and the family, should go where the evidence leads us. But at the same time, we need to understand. And this goes to an earlier point that I made, that this is not history for its own sake, that it's being commissioned for a particular reason, and that there are larger family objectives at play here. And that understanding what those objectives are, where the organization, where the family is, where the firm is at this point in its evolution, where it needs to go, and how the history can be enabled, or how the family and the firm can be enabled through this historical perspective to get there. Those are important considerations, and I think that then helps to reconcile or mitigate some of these tensions that one feels about a particular interpretation or a particular episode in that history.
I think that's a very good point, and might be the concluding point is also that the family itself should be or could be also considered as an organization. And there's some element of need to organize the family too, in a way. I mean, so as much as you strategize for the firm, you need to strategize for the family. And the past or history could be a very powerful tool in that respect. Rania, I think we get to the end of that Q&A. So if you want to conclude, and I just want to thank again John for that very, very inspiring talk today.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you, everyone who took part in this webinar. We hope that you found it insightful. We invite you to join our last webinar next week. It will be in French about resilience levers of family businesses to navigate the crisis. We hope that you will stay connected with us, stay safe. So feel free to write us an email and also to connect our social media, LinkedIn or Twitter. We will send you an email with a replay of the webinar and some links so you can have reach to the references that were mentioned here, and we are happy to to answer any questions in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye bye. Keep safe and have a good day, everyone.